So I've given this presentation a couple of times now over the past few years. There's always little updates to CaRMS and the admissions process, so it's really good to have some time in front of you right before file reviews go out, which will happen this afternoon. We also want to talk about unconscious bias in residency admissions, and I am by no means the expert when it comes to this, but this is something that we have been advised from PGME and from the AFMC that it should be instilled in all of our throughout the admissions committee and in all of the people who are involved in the file review and interviews and that kind of thing. All right, so the first half of this presentation will be more on unconscious bias, talking a little bit about the theory, and then the second half will be more the logistical, practical tips regarding file reviews and interviews. And please interrupt me if you have a question. I can't currently see the chat, but if anything comes up, I'd rather be interrupted at the time. All right. So conflict of interest. I don't know that this is actually a conflict of interest, but I am the chair of the admissions committee for the family medicine residency training program, have been for a couple of years. My only interest is making sure that we get the best candidates we can get and where we fully match. I do have a brief land acknowledgement, and this is from the Memorial University land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. And we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, the Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. And we encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are their traditional territory. All right, and just a special thanks to the admissions committee and the team on a successful match last year, despite having some new IMG seats thrown in there and having to kind of scramble. So thanks to everybody, and thanks to everyone who's involved in file reviews, interviews, rank order meetings. Certainly wouldn't be able to do it without you. And so I will just send a shout out to our admissions members. So currently we've got Carrie Lynn Williams, Russell Da, Elaine Sia, who's new this year, Susan Avery, who's off on sabbatical, Lisa Burke, who's also new, Ian Parsons, who's been at this for much longer than I have, Christine Aubrey-Basler, Sonny Collis, Val, and Don, who are kind of the powerhouses of the admissions committee for sure. Thanks to those who previously sat on the committee, including Françoise Guigné and Scott Moffat. And there have been others in the past, but most recently they've just stepped off. All right, learning objectives. So we want you to be able to describe what unconscious bias is, and we're going to talk about some of the evidence behind it. Explain briefly how the residency admissions process can be affected by unconscious bias. Usually that's in a negative way, but it can also be positive at times as well. And then some strategies that we can apply both at the individual level and maybe at the institutional level as well to mitigate that risk of unconscious bias kind of stepping in. And please let me know if I'm talking too fast. It's hard to know when you're talking to yourself. So the outline for today, we talked just briefly about the objectives. So I'll look at what unconscious bias is. We'll talk about the evidence over a couple of slides, the different types of bias that exist, how that impacts admissions, the strategies to mitigate, and then that last section will be on timelines, tools, and tips. So more of the practical stuff when it comes to CaRMS. All right, so the AFMC, or the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, and Postgrad Medical Education have advised that the training is recommended for all involved with the selection process. Postgrad has done some sessions on this in the past as well. This presentation kind of summarizes the key points from the top video that's linked there, the one for academic physicians. And so if you want to get a little bit more in-depth information, I would certainly recommend that top video. It's about a 20-minute video, so not too bad. And you can listen to somebody other than myself talk to you about unconscious bias. All right, there is a more in-depth version. I feel like it has less applicability to the CaRMS process. It's more regarding peer review and unconscious bias in research, but certainly if you are interested in the topic, you can do a deeper delve. That one's closer to probably an hour and a half. All right. So what is unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias? And it is exactly what it says. So it's things that are unconscious to us or outside of our awareness. These are attitudes and stereotypes. They can affect our understanding, our interactions with others, and most importantly, the decisions that we make, especially if they're snap or quick decisions. It is nearly universal. So while we may want to believe that we aren't biased, most of us do have unconscious associations about other people based on different characteristics, whether it be race, gender, social class, appearance. And that's been studied extensively. One of those common measures that's listed there is the implicit association test. And if you haven't done it, I'd certainly recommend you have a flick through. It's really eye-opening. There is a link there. Flip it to test it. It's a TEDx talk by a female leader, and she talks about how she has an unconscious bias towards female leaders. It's about, I think, 8 minutes long, but really, really interesting. I'm not going to show it during this session for the sake of time, but I would highly recommend you check it out. So even if you Google flip it to test it, it's a TEDx talk. It's really good. Her name is, oh gosh, I don't have it written down. Anyway, you will be able to find it. Pardon me?
Kristen Pressner. I just
There
Googled
you
it.
go. Perfect. You've seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I'm going to watch it on your recommendation. I just Googled it just now. So
Yes, that's her. Really good, really, really well done. And so unconscious bias or implicit bias is in direct contradiction to explicit. So that's conscious that we can intentionally regulate. It's interesting because people say that we can so we can regulate, of course, what we say, but our body language and stuff can tell a different story and can show us sometimes that there is some unconscious bias depending on who we're interacting with. All right. So, and these are formed generally because our brain is trying to do things faster over time. So there are shortcuts that our brains form based on our experiences. So things that have happened in our past, things that other people have told us, social media, institutional influences. And it really tends to come out when we have to make quick decisions or snap decisions. And again, that's that brain's trying to pull things together to make a snap decision is one of the reasons that we try to slow down as we're going through the CaRMS process and the admissions process and make sure that we're being deliberate in our discussions and in our decision making. All right, so and there's a lot of information on this slide, so bear with me. This basically just goes through a review of some of the evidence that unconscious bias exists. They broke it down based on that previous video. They broke it down based into 3 areas. So bias in evaluation, bias in the hiring process, and bias in leadership, especially within the medical schools. And so there was a study, and these references are a little bit old, but there are certainly continual updates to these. I mean, it's not that so unconscious bias exists and we know that now, so it's not like it has to be continuously re-updated to say, does it exist? We know that it does. So this first study is from Trix and Penska, and they reviewed about 300 recommendation letters in a medical school in the US. And they found that the recommendation letters for women were shorter, had less, I'll say, quote, and professional respect, and were 2 times more likely to have gender terms such as insightful young woman, whereas the recommendation letters for men used more of the standout adjectives. They talked about men being excellent or superb or outstanding. And so the suggestion was that women's success was more associated with their effort, how much time and effort they put into things, while men's success was associated more so with their ability. When it comes to hiring, I find the blind orchestra auditions just fascinating. So apparently prior to the early 70s, orchestra auditions were done in person. Mainly the hiring was done by men, and so of course more men were hired. When they actually changed, so sometime in the mid to late 70s, to conducting these auditions behind a screen, suddenly all of these women were hired into orchestra that never would have even gotten a chance. They even talked about how evaluators started to pick up on hearing like a shoes clicking and saying, okay, maybe this is more likely to be a woman. And so they were telling people to not wear shoes so that there was absolutely no bias when they went out to perform and to audition. I just find that really fascinating. In hiring, so there was another study that was done looking at hiring processes in academia. 200 and something psychologists were asked to rate one of 4 versions of basically an identical curriculum vitae. So all of these CVs came from a real life scientist at 2 different stages in her career, but the names were changed to Brian and Karen. And so they changed these to the 4 versions. They called it a female job applicant, a male job applicant, a female tenure candidate, and a male tenure candidate. And so when the psychologists actually looked at those CVs, both the men and the women psychologists were more likely to vote to hire a male job applicant than a female job applicant, again, with an identical record sitting in front of them. They were also more likely to report that the male applicant had done adequate teaching, research, and service compared to the female applicant. And at the tenure level, they were equally likely to recommend Brian or Karen, but 4 times more likely to include what they call cautionary comments on Karen's CV. So it's really interesting. They also did a similar study with resumes with more, and I'm doing air quotes, white sounding names versus African American sounding names, and they found the same type of thing. They've also done that with mothers, and they found that mothers were 43% less likely to be recommended for hire than non-mothers. And interestingly, fathers were not penalized, and in some cases actually benefited from their parental status. In leadership, so there were 198 medical school faculty asked about their goals and their experiences, and generally between genders there was no difference in terms of the faculty members' aspirations, whether that to be a leader or their willingness to take on time-consuming tasks. But despite that, women were less likely to have been asked. So asked to serve as a committee chair, asked to be involved in direct decision making, or to feel that they had influence in the department. All right, and this is actually from the U.S. They looked at the prevalence of African American and Hispanic individuals in the U.S., 13 and 18% respectively, but they only make up 6% and 5% of med school graduates, and only 3 and 4% of full-time med school faculty, respectively. And so that discrepancy actually gets worse the higher you go up in leadership. Persons with disabilities estimated at 8.7% of the general population. Again, this is in the U.S. The prevalence of physicians with disabilities is only at 2.7%. And while women currently outnumber men in the med school classes, the disparities again exist as you move up the, we'll say ranks for lack of a better word. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of time as we go. Right, so there are different types of unconscious bias. This one, probably familiar to a lot of us, confirmation bias, which is a tendency to interpret information as affirming our pre-existing beliefs. And I thought that cartoon, which I stole from Russell, illustrated it perfectly. Did you read my paper? Yes, but only proved what I already knew. Other types of unconscious bias or bias in general include gender bias, institutional bias, so based on an institution's reputation, size, type, or location, age bias, which can be directed either way, indigenous bias, language bias, especially as it relates to Francophone research and applications in Canada, and there are many more, so this is not meant to be exhaustive. And so why do we need to know about unconscious bias? Well, it has a huge impact or can have a huge impact on admissions, and we need to make sure that we are aware that it's present and do what we can to mitigate. Everyone involved in the selection process does carry some unconscious bias. When you do your implicit association test, if you haven't before, you will see some of that. And what we're trying to do is adopt best practices so that we limit the influence it has. I don't think we can get rid of it completely, but we can try to mitigate some of that risk. It should be standard practice across the board, and certainly our program values equity. And so these processes we're going to talk about will demonstrate that and hopefully promote that. And hopefully having even sessions like this are helpful to bring awareness. All right, so we know it exists. What can we do to mitigate the risk? And so again, at the individual level, it's acknowledging first that the biases exist. So not sticking your head in the sand and saying, this great that she's talking about unconscious bias, but I'm not a biased person and therefore it doesn't apply to me. Generally applies to everybody. We should recognize or try to recognize when we're engaged in a thought or an action that's based on one of the stereotypes as mentioned before. Worthwhile, definitely, if you haven't, to take the implicit association test, and I do have the link there as well. And as I mentioned, these biases tend to be a little bit more prominent when we're making quick decisions. So trying to slow down, self-reflect on the process helps us to avoid bringing those biases into our daily lives. You want to try to increase your exposure about diversity and work on consciously changing the particular stereotypes that you might hold. And so I'll talk about that. So they recommend things like stereotype replacement. So thinking about a stereotype that you hold or that you've picked up on the implicit association test and then consciously replacing it with accurate information. I like one of the positive counter stereotype imaging. So actually picturing someone who counter stereotypically fills a traditionally stereotyped role. And then that discomfort that you have with that is that indication that there is some unconscious bias there. Perspective taking, so putting yourself in someone else's shoes, taking the perspective of someone in a stereotyped group. And then individuation, so really looking at the particular person in front of you or the applicant in front of you to prevent any group stereotypes which would lead to inaccurate assumptions. So we're committed to looking at the individual in front of us, not based on the group that they may belong to. Right. And so an example of perspective taking. So before looking at a personal letter for a CaRMS candidate who might be a member of a minority group, imagine in detail what it would be like to be a person in that stereotyped group. Imagine you're an international medical graduate and you're questioned on the quality of your application based on racial issues or historical issues or cultural biases and stereotypes, and then stepping back from that and trying to reevaluate. So at the institution level, it's a little bit more tricky. It's a bigger machine, multiple moving parts. Some of the things that we can do as an organization is to make sure we're not engaged in activities that would facilitate unconscious bias. So for example, CaRMS doesn't unmask photos until after the fall review period. So generally when you're reviewing applications, you can't see the person that you're reviewing. You're just looking at the value of their credentials that are in front of you. They suggest using structured interviews, and so we certainly have our interview questions laid out well before the actual interview date. We don't change those on the fly. We try to have the same questions apply across the board to all candidates, making sure that there's sufficient time. Again, I've mentioned that a couple of times, but for example, sex bias is stronger when evaluators are under a time pressure. We should be providing training workshops. This is just one of what are many that are presented by Memorial University and also from PGME. And that committee is involved in high stakes decision making. I mean, you're talking about deciding whether or not somebody gets into the program of their choice. I think that's pretty high stakes after being in school for as long as they have. So the committees should be diverse in composition, and again, clear requirements and interview questions before the actual process starts. So our file review form is done well in advance of actually seeing the files. Our interview forms are done well in advance before actually getting into the interviews. So the next slide and the next two slides actually go through This is from the the AAMC. So this is the US, but they went over how to mitigate risk of bias in virtual interviews, which I thought was really interesting because all of our interviews are done virtually now and will continue to be likely because of the cost savings and the ability for people to interview across the country without cost or significant cost. So they talk about things like your virtual background. So even just being aware. So one, for the applicants, if you're looking at an applicant and their background is, I don't know, a hotel room or there's a garbage bag up in the background or whatever, like that will unconsciously bias you as you're grading them. So having them or requiring that they have maybe a solid background would help reduce that unconscious bias. And the same thing for us to make sure that we have our backgrounds kind of clean and solid so that we're not introducing bias. Pronunciation of names. So this is a big one. So trying to make sure that we're pronouncing people's names correctly. And if we're able to even get that in advance, that's helpful because this is a high stakes situation for them. They're certainly going to be nervous as they come into the interview, and anything we can do to make them feel more at ease, I think is really appropriate. Offering a technology check session. So when we first switched to virtual interviews, we sent out to all of our candidates the platform that we would be using for our interviews and offering to do like a one-on-one interview with them, or like a test interview with them to help them through any of the technical glitches that might come up. Offering implicit bias training for interviewers, what we're doing today. Standardizing the questions, I talked a little bit about that. Multiple mini interviews are supposed to be even better than the standardized questions in terms of reducing bias. Offering the opportunity for mock interviews, having diverse interviewers. And so we have interviewers from across the province. Is helpful again, and we usually have more than one interviewer, so it's not one-on-one, it's usually a resident and a faculty interviewing the particular candidate. One of the things we haven't done yet, which would be interesting to do, however, is post-interview feedback to find out how candidates have found our process, and we can certainly even check with our current residents about how they found the process. Okay. Right. So, I mean, generally what it comes down to is recognizing that there is unconscious bias, that we all have it, whether we think we do or not. And that once we know and we've acknowledged that, then we can try to reduce its impacts. I'm going to switch. So these are a pile of resources. Most of these are actually from postgraduate medical education and have been vetted through them. So you can have a look through. Some of the papers that I've talked about are here as well. And I'm just going to switch gears to more of the CaRMS related stuff, but I'm going to stop first to see if there's any questions before I move on to this section and find my chat.
Amanda, unless I missed it, it's Wendy here. I don't think there's been anything in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Any questions that anybody wanted to unmute and ask or chat about or bring up before we move into the practical tips?
So far, so good.
All right, perfect. And moving on, so CaRMS 2024. So promotion is ongoing. I think we may have finished up with the last of the meet and greets. So for anyone who's not aware, our meet and greets are done by stream, usually attempt to have 3 to 4 sessions over the course of the fall leading up to the deadline for submission of documents, which was December 1st. And they are all advertised on the CAMPREP national calendar of events that the AFMC has control over. And it's again online promotional presentations. The program does an overview each of the streams, and our admin residents pull in other residents and do a Q&A session, or a number of Q&A sessions, which I think go over really well with the candidates. We are trying to be present on social media, and Kristen Piercy in the residency training office has been integral in that for us here at the general program. So we have a Facebook page, we have an Instagram account, we have, I guess, an X account. I'm formerly Twitter. I just updated that. And then there's stream specific accounts that can be followed as well. As we're mostly virtual now we're virtual with our interviews, the promotion has to be virtual as well. Okay, so this is a busy slide, but there's a lot of important information on it with deadlines. So most of you would have been sent out the CaRMS timelines well in advance on a couple of different occasions. But just as a reminder, so today the files will be sent out to you. You will get somewhere in the realm of 11 to 12 file reviews, and they will be due back on December 15th. Electronically only, please, because the committee then meets. So between the 15th and the 20th, the Don and Val in the residency training office will actually compile all of the file reviews into a giant spreadsheet with all of the information we need. And then the admissions committee will meet on December 20th and review all of those. And after that date, I believe the CaRMS deadline is January 5th to have the offers of interviews out to all of the candidates, which it's a bit unfortunate because it's right over the holiday period, but they have to get out quick. So we'll usually have those out to them so probably by the 22nd, before we break for Christmas. And then interviews will be on the 17th and 18th. And again, they're via WebEx, though my understanding is that may change in the future, not for this round, but that we may be switching to a new platform virtually. On the second day of interviews on January 18th, we have a virtual social. That's usually well attended, and it's quite fun actually. So all the streams have their own breakout rooms. There's usually a trivia breakout room. Jared Butler tends to be our MC, and we'll kind of invite people to check out the different rooms and greet people as they come into the main social. It's obviously not the same as an in-person social that we've had in the past, but this kind of levels the playing field again. And I think it's still an enjoyable time. We have our rank meetings that happen then the week after. So January 23rd is the Eastern Stream rank, and that will be the IMG rank as well. The 31st will be Nunavut and Goose Bay stream ranks, and then Central and Western the day after. We have to have our rank order lists for all of those. So each of the 5 streams, as well as each of the IMG streams, of which there are 3 this year, to PGME for February 5th, and then they submit them off to CaRMS for us. And then match day is March 19th. And what you'll find is year over year now going forward, the CaRMS timeline will shift a little bit more earlier in the year. So file reviews will probably start late November as opposed to early December. So this is the new trend. Previously, if you remember, we used to have file reviews into January, and then interviews not until later in February. All right. So the second iteration always gives me palpitations because of the short turnaround time. So CaRMS opens on the 4th of April, and we have to get the files to the streams and to everybody who's doing file reviews by that evening. On April 8th is interview day, so that's like over a weekend, so not a whole lot of time. And then file reviews are due back the same day. And then April 10th, our committee meets and reviews all of the feedback to create the rank order list. And then the rank order meetings will happen with any of the streams that have seats remaining in the second round. I always cross my fingers that we won't go into second round and we'll fully match the first round. But as far as I know, as long as I've been chair or been involved in the missions committee, it hasn't happened. But you never know. Maybe this year. April 25th is match day number 2. Okay, so what's new for 2024? So I've kept the FM Pro C here because this is new-ish. This is our second year using this. It is similar to the Casper, if you remember the Casper. It's a situational judgment test. It looks at 4 attributes in candidates. So professional integrity, adaptability, team working, and empathy and compassion. So it's the stuff that it's harder to pull out of a file review and out of the documents on CaRMS. It is required to apply to our program. It costs approximately $40, I believe, for the candidates to do that. And it has been created by Family Medicine for Family Medicine. So it's undergone and is continuing to undergo rigorous testing to make sure it's meeting standards. We won't actually know fully how that applies to residents who are in practice until a number of cohorts have gone through. But there is ongoing research in that area. The CaRMS document checklist. So this is also new-ish, past 2 years. This is meant to make your life easier, not harder. On the front of all the file review forms, you'll see this little checklist. I've got a snapshot of it there on the right. And it's meant to go through quickly to make sure those things are included in the file when you review them on CaRMS. If it's not there, then you get to just write your name and send it back to Family Medicine and say it's an incomplete file. Because if they're incomplete, they can't actually get an interview. You need to make sure before you send that back to us that you've checked in other documents. So sometimes candidates will upload the CV into the wrong place or their transcripts in the wrong place. And so just make sure that you've reviewed all of the documents in the file before you say, yes, it's not there, or they've labeled it wrong, or what have you. Okay, so IMG streams, so we had 5 seats last year. It was the first time. This year we have 5 seats again in the first round. But we have made some changes. So now IMGs can apply to streams, sort of. So there are 3 seats for Eastern. So IMGs can apply to Eastern. They can apply to Goose Bay. There's 1 seat for Goose Bay, a Goose Bay IMG. And there's one, we call it an urban and rural seat. Basically, that's a seat that has some flexibility in terms of what stream they will match to once they match to our program. There is a return of service that is associated specifically with these seats. From my understanding, it's 2 years if they're signing on to work in Lab Grenfell and 5 years if they're signing to work anywhere else in the province. I have the link there from PGME regarding the IMG stream, and I think there's also a frequently asked questions from the Government of Newfoundland that talks about this return of service as well. The CaRMS guidebook is new for this year, but it's not actually new. We basically pulled together all of the information from all of the documents we've sent you in the past. So we used to send out a CaRMS statement and a CaRMS Q&A document and a couple of other things. Now we've got everything consolidated into one document, so only one thing that you have to keep track of. The CaRMS statement and the CaRMS Q&A document historically came from the fact that when we were doing in-person interviews, we had a Q&A document that we could actually hand out to candidates. Then we started sending it out electronically to file reviewers and interviewers, and now we've just melted it all into one. All right. So for file reviews this evening, you will get the file review form, you'll get the document checklist. There have been a few small changes to the structured reference letters, but there's no change in how we mark. So the forms should look the same or very similar to last year. We have previously done a presentation on structured reference letters. I think Dr. Aubrey Basler gave that one, Christine. And so we can share that with you if you want. To refresh your memory. The personal letter will now be marked at a 15 instead of 20, not because we're marking down the importance of the personal letter, but because we're making room for the FM Pro C score to fit in there as well. If you are reviewing IMG files, it will clearly state that in the email that comes to you. Most of you will probably be doing IMG files. There's also an IMG DO form. So that's a PGME specific form. I've actually got it. I'm going to go to the next slide here to show you. It's all of the same stuff that you're going to be going over in your file review anyway, but it's more all in one place so that PGME can look at that, vet that, make sure that the candidates are actually eligible for licensure, and that's with CPS&L. I'm gonna leave that up for a minute. Okay. And so for the interviews, so you need the CaRMS interview form, the guidebook, again, nice to have on hand in case candidates ask you questions that you might not be familiar with answer. You can look it up in the guidebook. You can find out at least who to send them to. Really important to note, so the interviews are 30 minutes long. There's 45 minutes allotted in total to allow you to complete the interview form. So even if interviews are scheduled one every hour, the interview itself should be 30 minutes long. We try not to go over, try to stay on time so that the next one can start appropriately. And also, Don has to actually individually move all of the candidates to different breakout rooms, and there could be upwards of 20-25 interviews happening at the one time. So it is a big to-do. It does require a bit of time to move people. So the best we can stay on time to that 30 minutes, the better. And it's also fair to have that same amount of time for all candidates. I will just make a comment on ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence. So there's been some discussion that candidates can actually come up with answers to interview questions based on using ChatGPT or artificial intelligence. And so the recommendation is that we have our interview questions more kind of situational based, and generally ours are. So that should help as well to mitigate any of that risk. All right. So for interviews, we try not to review the candidate before the interview. It's more reliable, more fair. We remind the candidate that we haven't reviewed their file prior to the interview, and that allows the candidate then to expand on any highlights of their application. Or if they're thinking, oh gosh, I don't know if this is coming across properly in my personal letter, or there's a gap in training that I really want to be able to explain, then that gives them the opportunity to do that. And what I have just listed here is different things that we can do in the interview to make them more fair. So asking questions that are job related, certainly, not having probing questions. And again, in our case, we're asking just the questions that are on the sheet, not anything else. Use of situational questions. Longer interviews tend to be a little bit better. Again, having no access to applicant information before or during the interview, and important to allow the applicant some time to ask questions. We have multiple interviewers at the same time. If you look at under evaluation, we recommend or encourage people to take notes so that can help put their answers into context. And we try to train our interviewers a little bit beforehand as well. All right, so really important, avoid asking questions outside of the interview form. You shouldn't. You should stick to what's on the script, basically. When you're doing the evaluation, you make sure you form your opinion of the candidate and you do your grading without discussion with the other interview team member, not to come to a consensus. You're marking them individually. Certainly rank the candidates based on the scales that we have on the interview form. And be careful what you write on the interview forms. It should be objective. All of these things are documents that can be requested by applicants, and so you should be as objective as possible. And if this presentation has done anything, it's told you that we all have unconscious bias, and so we just need to be objective in our comments. We shouldn't, if there's interruptions in the interviewing process, that shouldn't be considered in the marking or the evaluation of the candidate. So if there are technical difficulties, we aim to get them back on WebEx. If we can't get them back, then we can call them as well. But again, that shouldn't impact how they score on the interview. All right, so this is actually direct from CaRMS. They have interview guidelines. They've updated them as of July 24th, 2023. I've got them linked there. Really good to have a review through. There's a lot of stuff in there. I'm not going to touch on everything today. I don't have time to touch on everything today, but important to review. So making sure that interviews don't include any personal questions, making sure that we don't ask about how applicants are going to rank our program, how they thought the interview went, or anything like that. Certainly we can be encouraging about applying to our program, but we can't exert unwanted pressure on the selection decisions of applicants at the end of the day. We're not allowed to ask how they rank or how they plan to rank our programs or how they plan to rank our individual streams. If they bring that up in an interview, it's okay to acknowledge that, but you can't ask directly. So things to not consider in marking of the candidate, we talked a little bit about that already. So any technological issues not to be included. And then I don't know why I actually show this slide because it's examples of things that you shouldn't ask during an interview, but it matters really not at all to us because we have our interview questions that we ask and that's it. That's where it should end. If a candidate does mention any of this, you can accept it, you can acknowledge it in a neutral way and then move on. Stick to the script. So in summary, I just want to say we need to recognize that we have implicit bias. We all have it. That talk, flip it to test it, that TEDx talk, that 8-minute talk, super interesting, opened my eyes. We have implicit bias. We need to do what we can to try to mitigate it. CaRMS has given us kind of a framework to follow, and we just have to continually try to do better and be better. It certainly has far-reaching effects on equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism in medicine. And I think we're just kind of at the bottom of that that totem pole, working our way up. Okay, I think that's it for me. I'm going to stop for questions, and we've got about 14 minutes left. I'm going to turn my camera back on.
I have a question, if it's okay.
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, that's right. It's just going to be my first time ever doing file reviews, and needless to say, I'm terrified of just messing it up somehow. And is there going to be just an easy access resource for when I fumble through it initially?
Yes, so there should be a number of easy access resources. So the CaRMS guidebook is your first go-to, that document that's been sent out, but reach out to any of us. So I'm happy to chat by phone or text or whatever to go through any parts of that seem not straightforward. Don in the residency training office, Val in the residency training office, most of our admissions committee are pretty, would be pretty open to chatting and helping you through those things. So feel free to reach out. Our numbers are actually in the CaRMS guidebook as well. So we ask to keep that confidential, but certainly if you need me, reach out.
No, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yep, no problem at all.
And Amanda, I just threw you in the chat box.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I'm figuring out how to stop sharing here now so I can actually see people. Okay. Lovely. And most of you are probably seasoned file reviewers and interviewers anyway. But yeah, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them now or later on if you wanted to email me or call or text or what have you.
We used to try to kind of deliberately pair folks up if they hadn't done it before with someone and didn't find that that was getting taken up or used much. So we've left it for an as needed process now, but please do reach out to us if we can be of help.
Yeah, we also in previous years with I remember Dr. Butler and even Ian, I think at one point used to do an actual file review, like sit down and have a faculty development session and go through a file review, like a mock file review. But we found that it was easier if people were reaching out because depending on the uptake from year to year. So if there are new people file reviewing, then we've offered ourselves to be able to walk through it with you one-on-one.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'm not seeing anything else in the chat there either, Amanda. That was fabulous. Thank you.
Perfect.
And I'll say too, to Chris's question, that also if you just want help with a section of a file, like, you know, even if it's not the whole file, but if it's the letter, or you want to show something to a couple of colleagues to say, you know, I'd score this section this, what would you score this? And it should balance out. I mean, the thing is, while there's some subjectivity when you have different people interviewing and different people looking at files, Amanda, I don't know if you can speak to now, or if Russell, somebody else want to jump in, what happens when there is a big discrepancy. I think on most of these things all match, but there is also a process if you see big outliers in how, you know, you and I might have scored a file. Can one of you comment on what happens then?
Yep, absolutely. So we actually scan also, two people will review every file, and we scan through all to see if there's more than about a 10-point discrepancy in the files. And then we actually delve into the files. First, we check to make sure the math is correct. And oftentimes it's as simple as that. But then we also will pull up the actual file and have a look at it ourselves as a committee to find out. And we kind of get a feel over the years who are some of the I'll just say harder markers versus easier markers, and it does tend to balance out at the end of the day. But yes, there's a process in place to make sure we're watching for those major discrepancies between two file reviewers.
Thank you for that. I find when we have new people in our stream doing some files, that really gives them peace of mind to know that, like, it's not all on them. There is a process beyond them as an individual. So thanks for that.
And certainly you as an individual file reviewer clicking, you know, do not interview or whatever, all of that gets taken into context, right, with the other file review as well. So you don't have the final say, I guess, is what I'm trying to say in terms of whether or not someone gets an interview. We take all of that stuff into consideration before we make that decision. Yeah.
Just make a quick comment maybe that would help from my own experience over many years reviewing files. And from my perspective, and I'd be interested in knowing your perspective as well of whether I'm off base, but I've always, I mean, there are clear winners. There are clear, really strong candidates sometimes when you review them. And I think those are the ones you can actually brush over, in my opinion, in terms of making this a more reasonable time commitment and job, I guess. Those are the ones in my mind, whether they have I can't remember what the scoring scheme is, but a 98 or 96 or a 94, they're still going to be on that rank list. And really it's up to them about whether they get in the program or not, right? So the ones that we really need to spend a bit of extra time over are the ones that have some sort of borderline or questionable factors to their application. And those are the ones you really want to make sure you consider carefully to spend that time on.
Yeah, 100%. You hit the nail on the head. It really comes down to what the candidates, how the candidates are going to rank, and the ones that are doing well will generally be ranked, right? And so it's just a matter of them picking us. I see Christine's hand.
Hi, Amanda, that was great. And I mean, I've done these for a few years and I was still writing lots of notes while you were talking. So thank you. Can you comment quickly on electronic, you talked about staying objective because everything can be pulled. I remember seeing notes last year to make sure that things are deleted from our computer, that we're not keeping any paper notes. Do you want to just make a comment so we're all on the same page about that?
Yep, so we're only able to keep, and we have to keep our documentation for 1 year from the match date. After that time, anything we have should be anonymized and shouldn't be kept on our system. We keep our matched applicants information that goes into their secure binder, but we cannot keep any information on unmatched applicants, and that's a CaRMS requirement.
Right. So what that means for us, because we can't use paper forms, right? We have to do everything electronically. So that means you need to remove it from your computer. You don't want to keep it in these in your email. If you're, you want to make sure there's nothing on your personal
Yes, yes, absolutely. So, like logistically, that means like removing the email, removing the file from your computer, making sure it's not on your saved on iCloud or anything like that. And I would suggest not doing that until after the match day, right? In case, Don comes back and says, "Oh, where's that file review? I didn't get that one," and you still have it to be able to pass it along. But certainly we give that the year. So the program holds it for a year. You guys can actually remove it after match day.
Personally, as a file reviewer, I have a folder on my desktop which is labeled accordingly, and when I get the green light / reminder from Amanda, it goes in the bin.
Perfect. Chris, I see your hand.
A comment worth considering for next year. I meant to say this last year, but I think I forgot. And so we use Qualtrics for our research projects, and Qualtrics could be configured to do these file reviews. So all those questions that we go through for each individual applicant and each individual file, we could assign points to each of those boxes. You just click a box, the total is automatically summed. It's all saved electronically in a secure system. And it'd take a little bit of time to develop, but then there'd be more than that time saved, I believe, in the long run. Lots of email exchanges avoided, etc. Things like that.
Yeah,
I think you could even download those data and rank in order it would download a spreadsheet, and it'd be relatively easy then to rank all the applicants in order. Lots of potential time saved.
Yeah, I've wondered, Amanda, is physicians checking to make sure all the documents are there. Doesn't seem like a physician necessary use of time, right? And I'm wondering if that's something that we could delegate, or if there's software, or even maybe not a physician specific thing. But again, a conversation for next year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm taking notes. And Chris, I'd be happy to pick your brain a little bit more about the Qualtrics thing leading up to next round, which will happen again very soon. Like we'll be talking about that again in the summer. Yeah, so you just go from one right into the next. Russell.
Yeah, thanks. Christine, I was chatting with some other program directors last week in Saskatchewan about that as well. It's a great opportunity here in this process for AI to do more than it is. Unfortunately, we don't have anything that can really accomplish it at the moment. But I think a number of us are watching and waiting for that opportunity.
Right. Any other questions?
I've got to run, Amanda. Thank you very much for that. That was really useful.
Perfect.
Amanda,
Thank you so
it's
much.
Heather. Can I just quickly ask a question? So
Sure.
over the years, I just remember a lot from Roger about people and how they rank and how they score. So you'll see trends then amongst people. So I remember him telling me many years ago that I ranked too high, I score too high, and that he felt that that was like a real problem. So how is that addressed? Or
Yeah.
it's just an
So
issue, right?
yeah, so we look at discrepancies in scores. So if there are discrepancies of more than 10 points, we will look at that file in a little bit more detail. And as I mentioned, we do kind of get a feel for who are the more easier markers and the harder markers over time. So don't worry.
Okay.
I don't think it has a major impact on the rank order list or anything like that.
Perfect. Thank you, dear.
No problem. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.